Welcome back. This time we're talking about the Resident Evil film franchise, which debuted in 2002 and finished last weekend 15 years later with the sixth installment, The Final Chapter. Now, if you've seen my spoiler-free or spoiler-filled reviews of The Final Chapter, you know I'm a big fan of this series. It's one of my big guilty pleasures. Just one of those series where I can turn my brain off and just have some zombie action fun. Now, even though this is a guilty pleasure of mine, I like some of the films more than others. Again, if you've seen my reviews of The Final Chapter, you know I was not a fan of all of that movie, and you can be pretty sure that's going to be the first one we discuss, since I'll be starting with my least favorite, moving towards my most favorite. Now, another thing I need to mention is I've never played a single Resident Evil game. So I don't come at this as a fan of the games and try to say, oh, well, they ruined the games or they got this right from the games and that's why I enjoyed it. No. I just enjoy these films for what they were. Guilty pleasure action movies. It's just a franchise that has certain tropes that you can, safely rely on. You know that there's going to be zombies. You know that there's going to be some kind of mutated weirdness going on. You know at some point in time there's probably going to be a clock counting down. You know Alice, played by Mila Jovovich, is going to kick a lot of butt. And the last thing that you're going to know going into these movies is that pretty much every character that you meet is going to die, and is going to die in bloody fashion. If you know that, you can go into these movies and have a decent time with them. They deliver what I expect, at least until the final chapter. Now, before we get into the list itself, let me give you a spoiler warning. I am going to be talking about all 6 films as if you've seen them. So if you have not and don't want to be spoiled by what happens, stop watching now. But as far as the list goes, I think I've pretty much given it away. Number 6, my least favorite of the franchise, is The Final Chapter. I've already done 2 videos on this film, so I'm not going to repeat a lot of what I've already said. But as a quick sum up, this film does not wrap up any of the loose threads left behind by the previous movies. Gives us an entirely new story to try to care about, but it has so many contradictions and just plot holes that make no sense when you try to tie this into the previous movies. We also have a back step on some of the production issues, especially the prevalence of the jump scares, something that this franchise has always had but really hasn't been noticeably prevalent since the very first film. Ultimately, it was just a huge disappointment. Coming in at number 5 is Resident Evil Retribution, which was the 5th film in the franchise. Like The Final Chapter, a lot of my issues with this are story, and like that film, it begins at the very beginning, where it essentially resets the cliffhanger that we got at the end of the previous movie, Afterlife, where we saw Alice and the other survivors on the Arcadia being attacked by Umbrella forces. In a very cool reverse slow motion sequence, we see the attack on the Arcadia, which ultimately ends with Alice being knocked into the water, knocked unconscious, and she wakes up in this Umbrella test facility, which is the setting for the vast majority of this movie. And speaking of that opening sequence, I do want to say I do really like the music in this. It's really one of only 2 films in the franchise where the music was really noticeable, where I went, oh, I like that. The other being the original movie, which had a score composed by Marilyn Manson. But getting back to this test facility, Alice is being held prisoner. She is let loose by these forces that have been hired by Wesker, because he's apparently betrayed Umbrella and is now working with the last remaining humans to try to survive as a species. As a continuation of the story that we had gotten in the previous 2 films, this film is essentially a failure, because it just goes on this whole new tangent that doesn't have anything to do with rescuing the people from the Arcadia or Claire's group or anything that we'd seen in the previous 2 movies. It's very obvious that they're using these high-end simulations and all of these clones to bring back a lot of the favorite characters that had died off in earlier movies, such as Michelle Rodriguez. And as a concept, I didn't have a huge issue with that, because it does provide some interesting action, and there's always the opportunity that the next movie is going to get us back on track and get us back where we want the story going. Thus, this movie is not nearly as disappointing as The Final Chapter is. Now, from a plot standpoint, I'll say the one thing that really I just don't understand and couldn't get over is, yes, I can understand that they have this endless supply of clones. The problem is, where do they get all the clothes for the clones, as well as all the new shiny cars, such as what we saw in the New York sequence, a lot of which was getting destroyed by the big axe guy? Do they just have all of that laying around? That I couldn't understand. We're in the middle, or at this point, the late stages of the apocalypse. Where do they get it? I don't know. I will say that Luther West was a nice returning character. I enjoyed him in the previous movie. I enjoyed him here, although I thought his eventual death was very anticlimactic. We also see the return of Jill Valentine, who first showed up at the end of the previous movie, being brainwashed by Umbrella. It was nice to see her back because not only was she a major character in the second film, she's a major character from the games. Unfortunately, what made her so interesting was her kind of badassery, and that's been completely wiped out of her by her being brainwashed. She's just sort of a mindless automaton, and is just not terribly compelling or interesting as a character. And only really provided some tension in that we didn't know if Alice was going to be forced to kill her or not before the end of the movie. So this was a movie that I just did not like nearly as much as the first four. This is where the story really started going off the rails, but as I alluded to earlier, there was still the hope that it could get pulled back on by the next movie. Ultimately, that wasn't the case. So this film is kind of retroactively hurt by the final chapter in that the story problems it introduces are not fixed by the final chapter. And I promise this list is not going to be completely in reverse chronological order, but at number 4 we have Afterlife, which is really the film that started the trend that we see in the next two movies of kind of resetting the cliffhanger from the previous movie. Extinction ended with Alice threatening the upper management of Umbrella. She has teamed up with her clones and she's coming after them. Unlike the next two movies, we do actually get to see that somewhat played out because we see her and her clones invade the Tokyo facility. We get some pretty solid action with her confronting Wesker, but it does end with Alice being reset. She loses her superpowers and all of the other clones are wiped out, leaving her back to being human and back alone. From there, we see her go to Alaska to try to find Arcadia and get back together with the group of characters that we had met in the previous film. Unfortunately, she's only able to find Claire, who's suffering from amnesia, and they travel down the coast until they get to LA. They crash land on top of this building where there's some other survivors. And they learn that Arcadia was not a town, it's a ship, and it's off the coast of LA. And that these survivors are trying to get there because they heard the same broadcast that was alluded to in the previous movie. And as far as the main story goes, I enjoyed it. I liked the setting of the prison. I thought it was an interesting way to continue the whole zombie thing in a slightly different fashion, especially since we spent pretty much all of the previous film in desert. And it's a direct continuation of the story that we got in Apocalypse, with these people trying to find a safe haven. And really, more than any of the other films, this is one of the few that its main storyline is a direct continuation of the previous movie. Now, as I said, the prison does give us a lot of possibilities for solid action. One of the most memorable being the giant axe monster that I know is from the game, but from the point of view of the movie, really doesn't make sense of why he's in LA. But he did provide a pretty cool villain, since Wesker, our human villain, really only appears in the first 10 minutes and the last 10 minutes. I do have to mention, though, that this is really where the franchise, which has always been very cavalier with killing off characters, stopped even batting an eye when it did so. The prime example being Crystal, who gets pulled into the water by zombies. And Chris and Alice, who are right there, I mean, they don't even say a word. They just keep on going. I will say that the end battle with Wesker is a little anticlimactic, but I did enjoy that Chris and Claire got to have some, brother-sister fighting side by side, and also that Kmart got to help as well. And really, it left on a great cliffhanger with a lot of potential for where the next movie could go. And as I mentioned, that next movie basically hit the reset button again and went off in a completely new direction, ignoring the storyline that culminates at this movie that had been building over this movie and the previous one. And from this point on, the movies just sort of went on their own thing instead of trying to build off of the momentum of the previous movies. Now, coming in at number 3, and this was a difficult decision. 2 and 3 were probably the hardest to figure out, but I ultimately went with, at number 3, Resident Evil, the original movie. Now, before this most recent rewatch, I had not watched any of these movies in the past 5 years. I rewatched them in 2012 in the lead up to Retribution. And in my brain, in my memory, I was thinking, okay, the first one was the best. I really liked 2 and 3. And after that, it kind of fell off. Rewatching it, however, there were a lot of flaws in this movie that I just didn't remember. Now, I've never been an automatic zombie fan. This is not a genre that's really drawn me, and really horror as a whole is not a genre that I seek out. I don't watch many horror films. I review a lot of movies. Horror is not among them. But I remember seeing the trailers. I remember thinking, oh, this is based on some popular games. I knew people who had played the games. I never had. But the trailers really played up the sci-fi angle, and that's what I liked. I liked that this movie was more of a sci-fi movie than a zombie movie. Now, rewatching it, I noticed that it's very much a horror film as much as it is a sci-fi film, and not a very good horror film. It falls into a lot of the tropes and cliches that you get from mediocre horror films. That being a bunch of jump scares, a lot of jump scares, and basically everything else that you kind of expect from a horror film. The sci-fi elements, which is sort of the first half of this movie, is really what elevates it and makes it much more interesting. I like the introduction of Alice. I like the other characters that we meet, even though, like everything else, they pretty much die very quickly. The laser scene, which has been reused multiple times throughout the franchise, was great. It was new and different. And really, the zombie action was fun. This is not a movie I dislike watching. I enjoyed it. It's fun. Now, I will say there are some very wonky editing moments. There's a point where Alice is talking to, I'm blanking on his name, but he's the guy that ultimately becomes Nemesis. And he talks about how his sister had snuck into the facility to get evidence. And they're talking, and it's a very kind of expositional scene. And then they cut back to the other group of survivors, and suddenly Alice and him and the other guy are running in saying, open up the door, open up the door. What happened? What got cut out? I don't know. I was hoping there was going to be some deleted scenes on the Blu-ray. There's not. There's only an alternate ending. But again, this is a film that I can enjoy. You just turn your brain off and enjoy it. It sets up the foundation for me, was a solid guilty pleasure franchise. Now, coming in is Resident Evil Extinction. And the way I like to compare these is, if Resident Evil Apocalypse is the Mad Max of this franchise, Extinction is the Road Warrior. Where Apocalypse showed us the beginning of the end of civilization, and Extinction shows us after the fall. This film picks up several years after we see Alice escape at the end of Apocalypse, and the world is now a wasteland. We learn that the T-virus has not only mutated everything under the sun, it has also dried up the world and basically made it almost uninhabitable. This film provides some great action sequences. The crow scene is scary as heck, and a lot of fun. They play up the idea that Alice has these superpowers. They don't overdo it. They don't make her into an invincible being. But it does provide some interesting new ways to show this action. We also get some returning characters in Carlos and LJ, and some new characters including Claire and Kmart. Now, like with pretty much every other movie, most of the new characters that we meet are going to get killed off. We also lose Carlos and LJ along the way. But this film gives us an end goal beyond the mutants and the zombies and Umbrella, in that these people are trying to find a safe haven. And this, again, as I mentioned in my talk about Afterlife, that this is going to carry the story over the course of 2 movies before it's ultimately ignored by the next 2 movies. And one thing I did like about this movie, unlike almost every other one that we have, is that when characters die in this film, the movie actually pauses so we can absorb that loss, and it feels like more than just, oh, another character got scratched off. That these are people that people care about, and that we should have at least some kind of empathy for. I like the whole Mad Max vibe. This came out before Mad Max Fury Road, so this is something that we hadn't gotten in decades. So it was cool. I like what they did with it. It's a lot of fun. Again, it always has the same issues that any of the others do, but this is a film that I can thoroughly enjoy from start to finish. We've reached the point in this list where whatever flaws they may have are greatly outnumbered and overcome by the quality fun that at least I get out of them. Which brings us to number 1 on the list, and that is Resident Evil Apocalypse, the second film in the franchise, the only one to really pay off the previous film's cliffhanger. The last film ended with Alice waking up in a destroyed Raccoon City, which for fans of the game was a big deal. For those that didn't know about it, it just looked cool, and this film totally fulfills the promise of that cliffhanger. Picking up exactly where the last one went off, seeing her leave the hospital, and then doing a quick flashback to see how the city fell. And what I love about this film, more so than basically any other film in the franchise, this one really felt like it knew what it wanted to be, what this franchise should be, and that is ludicrous, ridiculous action, a fun time, and just the slightest wink at the audience that it knows just how ridiculous it is. And I don't think that any scene more exemplifies that than when Jill Valentine, who is a character from the games, shows up at the police station and just starts shooting zombies everywhere. I mean, it's so ridiculous, but it's so cool, and it's just fun. This movie is so much fun. And like I said, this movie is ridiculous, but it knows it's ridiculous and it knows how to have fun with it, but also not being a parody or anything like that. It takes itself not necessarily seriously, but it's not trying to be a comedy. It's an action movie, but it's trying to be a fun one. We also get Carlos, who is another main character from the game. We also get LJ, who's the greatest comic relief character of the entire franchise. Sure, if you want to just like nitpick the story and see where it makes sense and where it doesn't, you're going to find more things where it doesn't make sense than it does. But if you're having fun with it, then you can ignore these other issues. There's a lot of great quotable lines. My favorite, and I can't quote it directly because I do try to keep this channel family friendly, is when LJ shows up at the station with all the STARS members and one of them tries to hand him a gun and he's like, "MFR please, my stuff be custom," and shows him his gold-plated guns. I mean, it's where in the world, I mean, that is in no way realistic or makes sense, but it's fun. And that's what I keep trying to say, is this film knew what it was and had fun with it. Now, a couple interesting notes. First off, my number 1 and number 2 movies were the 2 movies in this franchise that were not directed by Paul W.S. Anderson. Now, I'm not trying to hate on him or anything, but I also don't think that it was coincidental either. And now the other thing is after I'd compiled my list, I went on to Rotten Tomatoes, something that I'm not a huge fan of lately, if you've seen my review for The Space Between Us. But I was curious to see how my ranking shaped up compared to the percentages on Rotten Tomatoes. And with the exception of the original Resident Evil, my list is basically completely opposite of their Rotten Tomato scores. None of them are high, of course, but actually the original Resident Evil and Final Chapter are tied for first at 34%, and Apocalypse, my favorite of the franchise, is trailing the pack at 18%. So there you have it. There's my list of the Resident Evil movies and what I think about each one. If you're actually still watching this, because I can tell right now this is going to be a long video, hopefully you're a fan as well. What did you think of my list? What were your favorites and least favorites of the franchise? How would you rank these movies? As always, you can subscribe to my channel, check out some of my reviews, and until next time, I'll see you at the movies.